Trump just keeps spinning like a weather vane, depending on whether he thinks he can get more personal glory and a bit more profit from the Russian side or from the Ukrainian side. And we had this picture yesterday, this entirely dysfunctional U.S. administration, where although Rubio was leading the delegation in Florida, the meeting was being held at Steve Witkoff's private club, right? And next to Rubio is Witkoff and Kushner. And there's a photograph, and it's interesting. The Ukrainians put it out, right? So it's like one of those official press snaps that you get. And if you look at the photograph, it's not too flattering at the Americans. Rubio looks like he's a bit dazed, right? But the Ukrainian delegation are just staring daggers at Witkoff. Absolutely staring. Why is this guy even at this table?
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are speaking again to Scott Lucas, Professor of US and International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, and also, of course, founder and editor of EA Worldview. Scott, thank you very much for joining us again.
It's great to be back, Louis. Thank you.
Well, Scott, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has had a weekend of negotiations with his Ukrainian counterparts. Both sides have spoken positively about the talks. Where does this leave the prospect of a kind of peace process finally beginning?
Well, I mean, the top line, Louis, is from the talks on Sunday in Florida between the U.S. and Ukrainian delegations is difficult but productive. And I think that productive side says, look, there's still adults in the room in Washington who are working with Ukraine and Europe. And among those adults in the room, our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. But difficult means that you've actually got not one, but two different processes at work running against each other. And neither of them, let's be clear right now, are peace plans. That's a misnomer, which is being applied really to a scheme which is a pro-Kremlin scheme versus the attempt of Ukraine and Europe working with Rubio to push that pro-Kremlin scheme back. So let me go wide on you first of all. Before we talk about the Europeans and Ukrainians, let's talk about the collusion between key members of the Trump administration with the Kremlin. And I do mean that word collusion in the sense that they are working with the Kremlin. They are cooperating with the Kremlin. In other words, this is not a peace plan. This is an ultimatum to Ukraine, which initially had 28 points, that was based on a Russian draft. And it was devised between Vladimir Putin's top economic advisor, a man named Kirill Dmitriev, a man who has long worked with the Trump camp since 2017. And he developed this proposal with Donald Trump's envoy, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, and with Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Now, the top lines on that pro-Kremlin proposal is that Russia is allowed to seize more Ukrainian territory. Not only can it hold on to what it has, about 19% of Ukraine, it is given the rest of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine has about 22% of Donetsk. Why is that important? That 22% of Donetsk is very fortified. It is key to the further defense of Ukraine and to the Ukrainian economy. It is the highway to Kyiv, as the Finnish President Alexander Stubb told Donald Trump this summer. So the plan devised by Witkoff and Kushner with the Kremlin gives that to Russia. It actually, in that draft, says that this will be legally recognized as Russian, and other areas that are held by the Russians, parts of the South and Crimea, will be recognized de facto by the Americans. But let's go farther with that plan. That plan keeps Ukraine weak. It says Ukraine can never join NATO. It limits Western military assistance to Ukraine. It caps Ukraine's military at 600,000 troops, 1/4 of the size of Russia's standing armed forces. It does allow for a reconstruction fund for Ukraine, but pay attention to this provision. 50% of the profits from that fund go not to Kyiv, they go to the US. And I'll explain the significance of that in a second. Russia, meanwhile, in stages. We'll have sanctions lifted. It will be readmitted to the G8 countries. It will have an amnesty on war crimes. And that means any Russian troops. That means Russians leaders like Vladimir Putin, who, remember, is wanted by the International Criminal Court over the deportations of Ukrainian children. They're off the hook. Now, I'm going to focus on that plan for just a minute, Louis, because I'm going to play connect the dots here. A few days ago, there was further information which came out, notably through the Wall Street Journal, and it was leaked. It was leaked to them, I'm pretty sure, by the European intelligence and diplomatic community, which said, where did this Russian plan come from? It goes back to April. You remember Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's top economic advisor, has worked with the Trump folks since January 2017. He's in contact with them, and he begins to devise this plan where the US and Russia can work together on economic projects, energy projects, rare earth minerals, other infrastructure projects. Around the same time that the Russians present this through Dmitriev to the Americans, Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer, is in St. Petersburg and then in Moscow. And you might remember, he has these talks with Vladimir Putin where Dmitriev is there. He's showing Witkoff around. Witkoff does not have another American official with him when he meets Putin. All he has is a translator who we later find out was provided by the Russian intelligence services. So this plan for US-Russian projects is kicking around when Witkoff is being courted by the Kremlin. Now, it isn't completed through the spring and in the summer. We can talk about all the complications with Putin overplaying his hand, refusing any type of compromise, and trying to bomb the hell out of Ukraine's civilians. But in mid-October, there's a problem for Witkoff in the Kremlin. The adults in the room in Washington are working with Kyiv and with Europe. They have restored intelligence sharing. They have allowed the U.S. to resume military equipment to Ukraine, albeit by selling it to NATO countries. And importantly, they have imposed sanctions or about to impose sanctions on Russia's leading oil companies, Rosneft and Gazprom, and the countries that buy that oil. India, Turkey, China, all could be hit by secondary sanctions. Witkoff on October 14th has a phone call with Vladimir Putin's top foreign policy advisor, Yuri Ushakov. And what Witkoff effectively does is he says to Ushakov, you've got to get to Trump and you've got to flatter him. You've got to say how important he is to making peace, etc. 2 days later, Putin calls Trump. Now, the day after that, on October 17th, Donald Trump tells Vladimir Zelensky in a White House meeting, you cannot have the Tomahawk cruise missiles. You cannot have them. And Ukraine was thinking we might get these for strikes inside Russia. At that same meeting, Steve Witkoff tells Zelensky, you need to give up the Donetsk region because everyone there, or most people there, speak Russian. Give it up. Now, Trump doesn't go that far. Trump holds out and says, oh, no, we should have a ceasefire based on the front lines. So what does Witkoff do? Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, the next week, meet Kirill Dmitriev in Florida. Dmitriev goes back to the Russian proposal, that plan that had been developed since the spring. That is the plan that becomes the basis of what I've just described, which is effectively an ultimatum to Ukraine. Okay? Sorry to set it all out, but that's where we are when we get a week ago to Geneva, when the Americans meet up with Ukraine and the Europeans are there as well. And it's like, will Ukraine give into this ultimatum? And Kyiv and the Europeans hold out. They don't accept it. And importantly, Marco Rubio, who does not like the Witkoff Kushner plan, he's the head of the U.S. delegation. So what do the Europeans do a week ago last Sunday? They present a counter proposal. And the counter proposal, importantly, starts with a ceasefire. We're not going to confirm any details about territory, about the military arrangements, the security guarantees. We're going to ceasefire first, then we'll discuss it. So Russia has to stop its air and ground attacks. Now, that goes back to what Ukraine and Europe have been doing to push back the Witkoff Kushner faction since the spring. Look, we'll talk ceasefire, and then we'll see what happens. And every time Putin has helped them by continuing to refuse to stop the Russian attacks. The European counterproposal goes further and says, okay, if we're going to discuss arrangements, we're not going to ban Ukraine from joining NATO, although there's no consensus on letting them in at this point. Okay, so they're not going to come in for the near future. Meanwhile, there will be Western military assistance as part of security guarantees to Kyiv. And Ukraine's armed forces will be 800,000 troops rather than 600,000. Russia will have sanctions lifted on it, and it will come back into the G8 if it complies. It's got to comply with the terms. Oh, and that reconstruction fund for Ukraine, backed by $1 billion in Russian frozen assets, the U.S. will not get 50% of the profits from it. Two competing plans, Louis, and that's where we were yesterday when Rubio meets Ukraine in terms of how far can we go with this plan before Steve Witkoff meets Vladimir Putin in Moscow tomorrow. And I've got some more inside information for you, but I've gone too far so at this point. So I'm going to shut up for a second and see where we take it from there.
No, it's good to get the whole thing laid out because it has been a big week of change. And as you say, Witkoff is due back in Moscow tomorrow, this time accompanied by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, as you mentioned there before. What should we expect out of that meeting? Because as far as I'm aware, Kushner has not gone along with Witkoff to one of these meetings in Moscow before, has he?
Exactly, Louis. And so there's a couple things we've got to watch here. Because the key question here is, are Witkoff and Kushner going to go there and tell Putin, look, you got a ceasefire? You got a ceasefire, then we'll discuss all of this. Or are they going to say, we need to talk how we push back against Ukraine and Europe again? What's our next move to get Donald Trump on board with you guys? Because behind Witkoff and Kushner, there's J.D. Vance. Now, J.D. is being quite quiet. He has been quite quiet, right? But when all this broke loose over the past couple of weeks, there were leaks from inside Washington and from Europeans that Vance is supporting the Witkoff Kushner initiative. So he knows what's going down. There's also a second element, which is key here, Louis, which I need to add, which has come out in the last few days. Remember I talked about Dmitriev talking about those U.S.-Russian joint projects? That's serious stuff. That's really serious stuff. Let me explain why. Vladimir Putin, some of the people who are connected with him, the Russian oligarchs, as you were, the billionaires, Gennady Timchenko, Yuri Kovalchuk, the Rotenberg brothers, Boris and Arkady, they have sent representatives to U.S. companies while they are sanctioned. These guys are sanctioned. They've sent representatives to U.S. companies to talk about rare earth mining and energy deals. Okay. Those talks also include revival of those Nord Stream pipelines from Russia to Germany that were damaged in the sabotage operations in 2022. But there's more. ExxonMobil's senior vice president, a guy named Neil Chapman, has met the head of Russia's largest private energy company, Rosneft, which is headed up by Igor Sechin, who is very close to Vladimir Putin. He's Putin's former private secretary. And there's more. Gentry Beach, who is a college friend of Donald Trump Jr. and a major donor to Donald Trump Sr., is in talks to get a stake in a Russian Arctic gas project. And another Trump donor, Stephen Lynch, has paid $600,000 this year to a lobbyist trying to get a Treasury Department license to revive the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from a Russian state-owned company. There are all types of economic links that are there despite the U.S. sanctions. So you got Kushner and Witkoff, both guys that are in it for economic deals, both guys who potentially could profit from those deals, and indeed Donald Trump could profit from those deals, who are in Moscow, backed by J.D. Vance, who wants to be president in 2028, and who is no fan of the European Union, and no fan of the defense of Ukraine. That's the big barrier that we've got coming up tomorrow, in the sense of, do they undo everything we have had from Russia, from Ukraine and Europe to push back that ultimatum over the past week and a half?
And what is going on here then with the US approach? Because obviously, on one hand, as you say, you've got Rubio working very closely with the Europeans, and then we've got Witkoff and Jared Kushner seemingly off in a completely different direction and being accused of working more closely with the Russians than they probably should be. Shouldn't there be an overall leadership here from the US president? It almost feels like they're putting a bit of blood in the water and letting the sharks fight it out.
You know the answer to this one, Louis. You can't get leadership from a guy who knows naff all about what is happening with Ukraine and Russia, besides some general idea that there's a lot of money to be made out of the project. So Trump just keeps spinning like a weather vane, depending on whether he thinks he can get more personal glory and a bit more profit from the Russian side or from the Ukrainian side. And we had this picture yesterday, this entirely dysfunctional US administration, where although Rubio was leading the delegation in Florida, the meeting was being held at Steve Witkoff's private club, right? And next to Rubio is Witkoff and Kushner. And there's a photograph, and it's interesting. The Ukrainians put it out, right? So it's like one of those official press snaps that you get. And if you look at the photograph, it's not too flattering at the Americans. Rubio looks like he's a bit dazed, right? But the Ukrainian delegation are just staring daggers at Witkoff. Absolutely staring. Why is this guy even at this table? Now, they've got to accept he's at that table. They've got to, the fact here is Trump is invested in this guy. He's been his friend since the 1980s, and he thinks Witkoff can bring him more glory and more money. Because I've got to add one other thing here. The fact why Kushner is back in part is because Kushner and Witkoff got a lot of capital off of the so-called arrangement to end Israel's mass killing in Gaza at the start of October. Now, that deal is shaky at best and could go pear-shaped. But for the moment, it's like Kushner and Witkoff went in, they talked to the Israelis, they, along with the Arab states, talked to Hamas's representatives, and then they got an end to 2 years of mass killing for now. So now they come back as the boys who did this. So now, I guess they can do the same thing with Ukraine and Russia. It's just, the thing here is that nobody does a due diligence check on who Witkoff's talking to. And I don't think Steve Witkoff went to Donald Trump and said, I'm going to talk to Vladimir Putin's top foreign policy guy, Yuri Yushakov. I think he probably talked to Kushner, he talked to someone else and said, all right, let's talk to Yushakov, see what we can do. Straight up, I'm going to tell you this, that at this point, the more functional arrangement, it's not one we like, the more functional arrangement is between Vladimir Putin's guys working with Witkoff and Kushner, right? That's what we're working with. And then on the other side, if you have what passes for a functional arrangement, it's Marco Rubio, his guys out of State Department, who are working with officials whose names you will never know because they're more at the working level within the military, within state, and within intelligence agencies who don't like this. They don't like the way it stinks. Should I add one other thing as well? There's a name that's missing here because he has effectively either been pushed out or just threw up his hands and said, I'm not sticking around. And that's Keith Kellogg, who is the longtime Trump envoy to Ukraine. Kellogg had sort of receded from public view last month. And then as Witkoff and Kushner are scheming, the only time he pops up is to do a Fox News interview. And then at the same time, it's announced he's out of here in January. Officially, he's resigning from the White House. But, you pay your money, take your choice on whether he resigned, whether he was forced out, or whether he just thought, Christ, I got better things to do with my life than stick around these head cases.
And we talk about some of the internals of Washington and the White House there. There seems to be some sort of shifting about going on in the Kremlin as well. Do you think we're likely to see Lavrov coming up again in any of these talks that we're expecting to see? And what does it mean if he isn't involved?
No, I think Lavrov is back. I think the simplest explanation is the one Mark Galeotti with whom you work on Frontlines put out is that Lavrov is in his 70s and he could well have been ill, and it may not have been a diplomatic illness. I think there was a bit of tension because around that mid-October period, before Witkoff talks to Ushakov in the Kremlin, the Kremlin had completely fouled up their hand, right? Remember, they were supposed to get the advantage back in August, which is when Putin met Trump in Alaska. And Lavrov was so confident of this. He's the one, he showed up. And, he's usually in that suit and tie, right? Natalie dressed. He showed up in that sweatshirt with the USSR logo on it, right? Like, dude. Now, whether he took a bit of personal grief for overplaying his hand, the fact is that the Kremlin did not get an advantage out of that August summit. If anything, Zelensky and the Europeans were able to push back. And they, as I said, they got the restored intelligence sharing. They got the renewed American military supplies, and they had the possibility of the Tomahawks. So rather than saying that, Lavrov was pushed out at that point, I'd say, look, the Kremlin was on the back foot at that point. We weren't sure where Lavrov was. We weren't sure what Putin was up to. And as I say, the people who helped put the Kremlin back together, as it were, are guys who can't put the U.S. administration together, which is Steve Witkoff. Bless his heart. I've spoken to y'all for months about Steve Witkoff, and I've had fun with him, as the purported envoy and the real estate developer. And he's found his role. He's completely ineffective within the U.S. administration. He has no diplomatic experience. He has no experience on Ukraine and Russia, but he's really, really effective working as a Kremlin official. Really effective. So kudos to Steve for finding his place.
And yet Putin has suggested that Moscow is going to reject the new peace deal that seems to have been hashed out by Europe. But then they didn't also jump on the one that was proposed by Witkoff. Even if they kind of agreed with it, they never really came out and actually fully endorsed it. Why do you think the Kremlin keeps letting these agreements fall through, even when they seem to favor Putin's own ambitions in Ukraine? I mean, is it just confidence after Pokrovsk? Is it just they see this winter and think that they want to keep fighting, or is there something else going on here?
Well, let's take this step by step and then work out. First of all, look, the Kremlin doesn't say to the world, this is our peace plan. We had this since the spring. This is us, right? That's not your play here. Your play here is to say this is Donald Trump's peace plan. So they're not going to jump out on top of that. And again, that was all worked out between Dmitriev with Kushner and Witkoff back at the end of October, right? At the same time, you don't have a plan which is necessarily 100% what the Kremlin wants. Even Witkoff and Kushner might say, look, you can't simply call for Ukraine's complete surrender because Putin, to go to where we're talking, Putin's still talking about getting rid of the Zelensky government. He's still demanding the end of the Zelensky government. So what do? You have the plan which comes out, which says Ukraine can have some military, albeit a very limited territory. You make vague references to security guarantees. But the Kremlin's key demands are there. They get Donetsk, legally get Donetsk. They get de facto recognition of the rest of the areas they occupy, including Crimea. They get off the hook on sanctions, right? So they get their top line demands while making a few relatively minor concessions that take place. That's your play that happens. Now, where are they now? The problem for them is that it goes to Geneva just over a week ago, and Ukraine and Europe, as they have done throughout the Trump administration, are able to find an opening to push this back. And again, let me just delineate this because it's I think a really interesting story that adds layers to how you watch this. A week ago last Saturday, so 9 days ago, the day before the Geneva meeting, there are a group of US legislators that are up in Canada. They're at the Halifax Security Conference. And these senators and representatives have a joint press appearance, and 3 of them come out and they tell the press, oh, this isn't Donald Trump's plan. This is a Russian plan. And the Russians leaked this to the media. How do we know that? Oh, Marco Rubio told us this, right? Now, Rubio officially comes out and says, oh, no, this is fake. No, I didn't know. No, I didn't. Of course, Rubio told him that. Rubio primed these guys to push back on the Whitmer-Kushner Kremlin plan. And then the next day at Geneva, Rubio's got the space to work with Europe and Ukraine, and the Europeans have got the space to put the counterproposal. Now, there's a non-starter in that European counterproposal, which is Putin is not going to ceasefire until he gets what he wants. Not going to. We've seen that time and time again. So yeah, of course the Kremlin is going to push back on this, and they're going to push back on it by keep saying, let's get back to Donald Trump's plan, which is why Witkoff is back out in Moscow. Witkoff and Kushner are back out in Moscow. So I can't completely predict what's going to happen. I mean, because this is a gang that can't shoot straight. But my bet is that Witkoff and Kushner come back with some modified version of the Kremlin demands and try to see if they can impose them. And we go round and round again. The upshot of this is, and I will cut to the chase on it, this is a non-starter in the sense of you cannot have a resolution because of Donetsk. You cannot give Donetsk to the Russians because Ukraine will not accept it. The Europeans will not accept it. You cannot allow Ukraine to have Donetsk and establish it as sovereign independent territory because the Kremlin will not accept that. On top of that, then you say, well, can we at least get a ceasefire? And I'm going to say, no, if you don't have what the Kremlin wants, there's no ceasefire. So you and I are going to be talking next week after that, week after that, week after that about some other twist and turn in this bizarre circus that keeps going on, where Donald Trump continues to be absolutely unaware of the details of this, where Witkoff and Kushner are still thinking, man, there's contracts to be won, and where Rubio's thinking, once upon a time, the U.S. happened to be an ally of Europe and actually helped defend countries that were being attacked by the aggressors who were trying to break them up and take them over.
Of course, while all of this is going on in Europe and the US, Zelensky is facing his own political crisis in Kyiv. This weekend, his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, has stepped down after his house was raided by Ukraine's anti-corruption agency. While that's going on, we know that the money that should have been invested in energy defenses probably hasn't been invested where it should have been. It's looking like a pretty difficult winter ahead for Ukraine and Zelensky himself specifically, isn't it?
Difficult winter ahead, but there may be a way back. Thank God Yermak is gone. Let's start off with this. I mean, I was too cautious with you all for months when I talked to you here because I keep referring to a senior Ukrainian official who is reportedly up to his eyeballs in corruption, Andriy Yermak. Now because as an analyst, you have to say this, he has not been convicted of involvement in the $100 million investigation of kickbacks. So, sorry, the investigation of $100 million in kickbacks basically around Ukraine's nuclear energy industry. But Yermak is one of 8 suspects, some of whom have been charged over those kickbacks. And it just so happened that, last Friday, we got confirmation that his premises, so his home, other locations linked to him, had been raided by Ukraine's anti-corruption agency. And it was a day after that he resigns. In fact, he now says, I'm going to go to the front lines and fight for Ukraine and show how loyal I am to the country. It's like, well, good luck with that, Andre. But quick reminder about how serious that scandal was. It's, it not only it involves Yermak, allegedly. It involves Vladimir Zelensky's former business partner, Timur Mendic. It involves a former energy minister, Herman Halashenko. It involves a former deputy prime minister. So you're talking about the highest levels of the Ukraine government. And as you point out, right, Louis, it stings because you've got Ukrainians who are going without power because Russia keeps bombing the energy infrastructure. Ukraine has to keep trying to repair it and needs to have supplies to do so, including for their nuclear energy installations. And the money was disappearing, right? So the context of this, though, is, if you've got a long enough memory, is this actually had almost come to a head this summer because various groups in Ukraine's parliament and in the Ukrainian government were trying to break the anti-corruption agencies. They were trying to put them under a prosecutor general and end their independence. And it took protest in Kyiv to push that back. Zelensky had signed the legislation to curb the anti-corruption agencies, and then he retracted it. Thank goodness. If you go back to those protests in July, look at who the protesters are targeting as supposedly being behind this initiative. It's Andrei Yermak. So where are we now? We're here in the start of December. As you're going to go into the winter, as Russia will continue to attack, can Zelensky step up and say, I'm going to run a responsible government here? And let's put it this way. He came in 2019 to stop corruption. I think he had taken some initiatives to check the corruption. I think Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, both doing exemplary work when they're allowed to do so. But now Zelensky, he cannot afford another major scandal, cannot afford another major expose of someone close to him siphoning off the money. The people he has named or potentially naming as replacements for Yermak, for Ukraine's delegation that are currently talking to the U.S. and the Europeans, these are better people. These are better folks. Keep an eye in particular in Kirill Budanov, who's the head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, who is considered to be a relative straight shooter and has been quite effective, I think, during this Russian invasion. If you can establish that this government can be responsible to its people who have been betrayed by corruption, while at the same time holding off Russia's invasion, then you begin to write this, and the fact here is I've seen all the doom-mongering headlines in the Western media and certainly from the Kremlin. This is the end for Zelensky. It's not, but it is yet another critical stage where Ukraine has to show, as it has for almost 4 years, that it will not break, that it will bend, but it will not break.
Well, as we say, Scott, a lot to discuss, and I'm sure we'll be discussing the outcome of a lot of these developments this week again soon, and we'll look forward to your analysis then. But Professor Scott Lucas, founder and editor of EA Worldview, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you, Louis. See you next time.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.